The glass didn't shatter. That's the part nobody talks about. It just slipped. Touched the white tablecloth with the softest sound, barely a whisper against all that polished silence. And in a room full of people who had never once been ignored in their lives, that small sound was somehow the loudest thing I had ever heard. Every head turned, not dramatically, not all at once, the way heads turn when people have been trained to notice disruption without appearing to notice it. Slow, controlled, the kind of attention that costs you something just to receive it. I was already reaching for the napkin, already calculating, how fast, how quiet, how invisible could I make this moment, when I heard her voice. Not loud, she didn't need to be loud. Unbelievable, Ling, she said, one word, soft as powder, sharp as glass. And the whole room shifted on it. Before I even tell you what happened next, I need you to understand something about that night, about that room, about the kind of people who fill spaces like that and call it civilization. Because what happened to me in the Aurelius Grand dining room on a Thursday evening was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was something people like her have perfected over a lifetime. The art of destroying someone completely while never once raising their voice. And it would have worked. It had worked before. Except there was a man sitting at that table in a black suit who hadn't said a word all evening. And the moment I whispered something under my breath, one word in a language I was never supposed to know, he stood up and canceled everything, and my name is Tiana. And the night everything changed, I was carrying a bottle of 2011 Chateau Margaux to a table of people who had already decided I didn't exist. That's how it works in rooms like that. You're not invisible because people can't see you. You're invisible because they've chosen not to. There's a difference. And if you've ever worked a service job, yes, and if you've ever smiled through a moment that should have made you scream, you already know exactly what I mean. I had been at Aurelius Grand for 11 weeks, long enough to know the rhythms of the room. Which guests wanted eye contact? Which ones preferred you to be furniture? Which ones would smile at you in the lobby and look straight through you the moment they sat down with someone important? Table 7 that night was the kind of table that made the whole restaurant quiet down without even trying. 4 men, 1 woman, all of them the kind of expensive that doesn't need to announce itself. And him, the man in the black suit who sat slightly apart from the rest of them in the way that people sit when they are technically present but fundamentally somewhere else. He hadn't touched his wine. He hadn't checked his phone. He had spent the entire evening doing the one thing that made me avoid his side of the table entirely. Watching. I told myself it meant nothing. Then the glass slipped. I still don't know exactly how it happened. One moment the bottle was controlled and precise in my hands. The next, the base of the wine glass caught the edge of a folded napkin and tilted, and that small and soft sound of crystal against linen filled the entire room like a confession. The wine spread slowly, a dark stain across the white cloth. I'm sorry, I said, already reaching, already pressing the clean napkin to the spill. I'll have this fixed right away. And that was when Madame Yoon spoke. She didn't look at me directly when she said it. That was the thing. She looked at the stain, the way you'd look at a crack that appeared in something you owned. Unbelievable, she said. Quiet. Deliberate, like she was simply observing the weather. The men at the table exchanged glances. One of them, younger, soft-faced, the kind of man who has never once had to apologize for anything, pressed his lips together in a thin smile. Another exhaled, not loudly, just enough. I kept my hands moving, precise, controlled, at everything my mother taught me about not giving people the satisfaction of watching you come apart in front of them. I'll have a fresh cloth brought immediately, ma'am. You should have been trained before being allowed in here, Madame Yoon continued. Still soft, still composed, her silk dress didn't move. Her posture didn't shift. She said it the way someone states a simple fact, a thing so obviously true that raising your voice about it would be beneath you. This is not a street cafe. A few guests at the nearby table laughed under their breath. The heat crawled up the back of my neck. Not again. I had a whole system for moments like this. I'd built it over years. You keep your eyes at a neutral middle distance. Not down, because that reads as shame, but not up, because that reads as challenge. You keep your voice at one steady volume. You make yourself take up exactly as much space as your job requires, and not 1 inch more. I sincerely apologize, ma'am. It won't happen again. Sorry doesn't restore a ruined evening. That one landed differently, not because it was crueler than the others, but because it was so calm, so utterly unbothered. She said it while reaching for her water glass, her attention already moving away from me the way you close a tab you're done with. And I understood then that this wasn't anger. Anger would have meant I registered as something worth being angry at. This was something colder. This was management. The manager arrived before I could finish wiping the table. Breathless, apologetic in the specific, urgent way that managers are apologetic when the problem isn't you. When the problem is how you look standing next to certain guests. I'm so sorry, sir. This will not happen again. She's new. We'll handle this immediately. Handle. I knew that word. He turned to me, voice dropping. Step away. Now. Sir, I can finish. Step away. The table was watching. The room was watching. And I was doing the math in my head the way I always did. Rent, groceries, the light bill that was already 2 weeks late. And I nodded once. Yes, sir. And then the word slipped out. Under my breath, barely above silence. Gwenkanhayo? I don't know why. It wasn't for anyone in that room. It was for me. A thing my body said before my mind could stop it. A reflex from a part of my life I thought I had successfully buried. It means it's okay. But the moment it left my lips, the man in the black suit moved. Stop. Before I tell you what he did next, I want to ask you something. How many times have you watched someone get treated like that and said nothing? Not because you didn't notice, but because noticing felt like enough. The people in that room that night noticed everything, every single one of them. And not one of them said a word. If you're someone who sees what others choose to ignore, this channel is for you. Subscribe right now because this story is only getting started. And what happens next? Nobody in that room saw it coming. Nobody except him. People always want to know how the story ends. They want to know what he said. What happened to Madame Yoon? Yeah, and whether I walked out of that building with my head up or my tail between my legs. But before any of that, before the man in the black suit said a single word to me in that hallway, you need to understand where I came from. Because the word that slipped out of my mouth that night didn't come from nowhere. It came from a house. I was 9 years old when my mother, Adeyeze, brought me to Seoul. She didn't explain it as a move. She explained it as work. Mama had a way of presenting hard things in the simplest possible language. Not to hide them from me, but because she believed that if you named something too dramatically, you gave it more power than it deserved. There is a family that needs help. We will go, we will do good work, we will be fine. That was all. The house we arrived at was not what I expected. But I had imagined something like the places I'd seen in the magazines at our neighborhood clinic back home. Warm colors, family pictures on the walls, the organized clutter of people who actually lived somewhere. This house felt like it had been built to impress people who would never visit it. Everything was white or gray or cold metal. The floors were polished so clean I could see my own face looking up at me, uncertain. The curtains were always half drawn. And the silence, it wasn't peaceful, it was instructed. The kind of silence you maintain because you have been made to understand that your noise is an inconvenience. Mama was given a room in the back of the house, next to the laundry. I stayed with her. We were not introduced to the family formally. We were simply shown where things were kept and told what was expected. The hours, the standards, the specific preferences of people whose names we were not encouraged to use. The Korean came to me the way languages come to children who have no other choice, through repetition and proximity and the slow realization that understanding is its own kind of protection. If I knew what was being said, I could prepare, I could adjust, I could make myself less of a disruption before anyone had to tell me I was one. There was a boy, close to my age, maybe a year older. He had the particular confidence of someone who had never once been told that the space he occupied might belong to someone else. He didn't speak to me, not directly, but sometimes I would look up from the corner of a room and find him watching me with those cold and flat eyes, the way you'd watch something that had wandered into your yard and hadn't figured out yet that it didn't belong. They called him the chairman's heir. I didn't know what that meant then. I just knew that everyone in that house rearranged themselves slightly when he entered a room. Even the adults, even my mother. We stayed for 3 years. We left in a single night with 2 bags and no explanation. Mama never told me why. I learned eventually not to ask. But I carried the language, I carried the cold floors and the half-drawn curtains and the weight of that boy's stare. I carried all of it for 20 years without understanding what any of it meant, until the man in the black suit said, "What family?" And I realized the answer was already living inside me. As chapters 3 through 7. Afro-Noir Chronicles, the Korean Mafia boss, heard the waitress speak one word. He didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed about him in that hallway. Most powerful men move like they're proving something. Fast steps, sharp turns, the whole body announcing itself before the mouth opens. This man moved like someone who had already won every room he'd ever walked into and found it boring. His name was Park Jin-ho. I didn't know that yet. In that moment, he was just the man in the black suit who had said, "Stop," with the quiet authority of someone pulling a pin from a grenade. Calm, deliberate, and completely certain about what came next. The manager had frozen mid-sentence. Madame Yoon's table had gone so still I could hear the chandelier above us humming. While I was standing in a hallway that suddenly felt very small, holding a damp napkin, trying to understand what exactly I had walked into. "Walk with me," he said. Not a request, I followed. When we were far enough from the dining room that the sound of it became just a low hum behind heavy doors, he stopped and turned to face me. Up close, he was harder to read than I expected. Not cold, or not only pulled. There was something else underneath it, something that looked for just a moment like recognition. "Where did you learn Korean?" "I didn't learn it," I said. "I just absorbed it. When I was a child." Something shifted in his face, almost invisible. Almost. "What family?" And that was when the conversation stopped being about a spilled glass of wine. I told him what I told you, the house, the silence, the cold floors, the boy with flat eyes who watched me from the stairs. I told him carefully, the way you tell a story when you're not sure which parts of it are dangerous. I left out the things I didn't have names for yet. He listened without interrupting. That alone was unusual enough to unsettle me. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "What did they call the son?" he said finally. I hesitated. The chairman's air. The stillness that moved through him then was different from all the stillness before it. This wasn't control. This was something underneath control. Something older and heavier that he was managing very carefully so it didn't show on his face. It showed anyway, just for a second. Just enough. "You should never have been in that room," he said quietly. "I know," I said. I'll go back and—" "You don't understand." His voice sharpened at the edges. Not loud, just precise. "That room was never meant for you. The people sitting in it built everything they have on the backs of people like you, like your mother." My chest tightened. "And tonight, they reminded you of that." I didn't answer, because he wasn't wrong, and being seen clearly by a stranger is one of the most disorienting things that can happen to a person. He exhaled, made a decision I could almost watch him make. "I'm going to ruin them," he said. I stared at him. "The deal? Gone. That's billion." "Yes." He said it the way people say, obviously, like the number was the least interesting part of the sentence. "And that's just the beginning?" I stood there in that hallway, a damp napkin in my hand, and staring at a man who had just walked away from more money than I would earn in 100 lifetimes, because of one word I whispered under my breath. "Why?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. "Because you reminded me of something I've been trying to forget." He started walking again. "Come. We have things to discuss." And against every instinct I had ever built for my own protection, I followed him. The call came at 6:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I had not slept. I had been lying on top of my covers fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, replaying that hallway conversation so many times that Jinho's voice had started to sound like something I had imagined. The number on my screen was an internal HR line from Aurelius Grand. I already knew what it was before I answered. Miss Tiana, we're calling to inform you that your employment contract has been terminated, effective immediately. Your final payment will be processed within 5 to 7 business days. Please do not return to the premises. That was it. No explanation, no conversation, just a sentence delivered in the flat, a professional tone of someone reading from a script they had used many times before, in the specific way institutions terminate people they consider replaceable. I sat up slowly. Rent was due in 18 days. I had enough in my account for 11. I told myself it was fine, that I had survived worse, that I would update my resume that afternoon and start applying by evening and have something new within the week. I believed exactly none of it. By noon, I had sent 14 applications to every hotel, restaurant, and private dining establishment in the city that matched my experience level. By evening, I had received 3 automated responses. The kind that thank you for your interest while making it clear that your interest was noted and immediately discarded. By the following morning, I understood that something was wrong. Not just bad luck, wrong, deliberately wrong. My most reliable reference, a senior manager at the Grand Continental who had worked with me for 3 years and had personally written a recommendation letter I was proud of, stopped responding to my messages. No explanation, just silence. Then a former colleague called me, voice low and careful, to tell me that my name had been flagged in an industry communication she had happened to see. She wouldn't tell me who sent it. She just said, "Tiana, don't apply to anything in the premium tier right now. Something is moving against you. I don't know what, but be careful." I sat with that information for a long time. Be careful, as though careful was something I had ever had the luxury of not being. Within 72 hours, the full shape of it became clear. That Madame Yoon had not simply accepted the loss of that dinner and moved on. She had moved efficiently and quietly through her network and say a word here, a call there, and effectively placed a quiet hold on my professional reputation across every establishment that mattered to her circle. She never raised her voice. She never had to. That was what I kept coming back to. She had done all of this, dismantled months of careful work, erased references I had spent years building, with the same composure she had shown when she looked at the wine stain on her tablecloth, as though I were still just a minor inconvenience to be handled. My landlord received a visit I was not told about until my neighbor mentioned it in passing. A well-dressed woman had come asking questions. Very politely, very calmly, that night, my landlord knocked on my door and told me he would need me to move before the end of the month. He couldn't look me in the eye when he said it. And through all of it, through the terminated contract and the dead references and the quiet visit to my building, I heard nothing from the man in the black suit. Not a message, not a word. You know what the worst part of that silence was? It wasn't that I had trusted him too quickly. I knew better than that. I had spent my entire life knowing better than to trust a powerful person's words in an emotional moment. The worst part was that, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I had let myself feel like someone was standing in the same direction as me, and then that feeling just disappeared. If you've ever given someone your belief, not your love, not your loyalty, just your quiet belief, and watched them go silent when you needed them most, you know exactly how that particular kind of alone feels. Subscribe to this channel, not for the algorithm, not for me, but because somewhere right now someone else is sitting in that same silence, wondering if they were foolish for hoping. And they deserve to know this story doesn't end here, because it doesn't. I was on day 3 of no sleep and near empty accounts when I found the box. My mother was not a sentimental woman. She did not keep birthday cards or old photographs arranged in albums or any of the small paper proofs of living that people hold on to because they need evidence that their life has mattered. What she kept with purpose, and she kept very little, which is why the box surprised me. It had been sitting in the top shelf of my closet for 2 years, since the week after her funeral, when I had taken what remained of her belongings from the small room she had been renting and brought them to my apartment. I had told myself I would go through it when I was ready. I was never ready. But at 3 a.m. on a Thursday, with 11 days of rent money and no job, and a professional reputation that had been quietly taken apart by a woman in silk, I pulled it down from the shelf and sat on the floor with it. Inside was a small stack of folded documents, a photograph, and an envelope. I looked at the photograph first. My mother was young in it, younger than I had ever seen her in my own memory. She was standing in front of a house I recognized immediately, the white stone exterior. The half-drawn curtains, the kind of architecture that communicates wealth, not through decoration but through sheer, uninterrupted space. The Quan estate. She was not smiling. She was looking directly at the camera with the expression she wore when she was concentrating on something important. Jaw slightly set, eyes steady, present in the specific, contained way she was always present in spaces that did not belong to her. On the back of the photograph, in her handwriting, Seoul, 1998, before everything. Before everything. I held that for a moment. Then I opened the envelope. The letter inside was written in Korean. I read slowly, my lips moving slightly the way they still did when the language required my full attention. And as the words assembled themselves into meaning, something cold and methodical began moving through my chest. It was a termination notice, but not the kind delivered with even the pretense of professionalism. This was something else entirely. The letter informed my mother that her employment with the Kwan household was being discontinued immediately, that she had been observed engaging in conduct unbefitting her position, that she had accessed areas of the property she had not been authorized to enter. Those were the official reasons, but the last paragraph was something different. It stated, in language that was careful enough to avoid being called a direct threat while being impossible to misread as anything else, that she was expected to maintain complete silence regarding the household, its operations, its guests, and its business affairs. That any breach of this expectation would result in consequences for her ability to work in this country, that her immigration status as a dependent of her employer's sponsorship would be reviewed if she failed to comply. They had threatened to take her right to stay in the country. With a letter, on official household stationery, I sat on my floor and read it 4 times. My mother had spent 20 years saying almost nothing about our time in Seoul. I had interpreted that as a kind of emotional discipline, her way of putting something painful behind her and keeping it there. She had raised me to look forward, not back, to build, not mourn. But it wasn't discipline, it was compliance. She had been told to be silent, and because she was a woman with a child in a foreign country with no one standing in her corner, she had been silent. For 20 years. She had carried that letter in a box as she never opened, in a life she rebuilt from nothing, in a country she eventually made her home. And she had never told me, not because she didn't trust me, because she was protecting me, the same way she had spent those 3 years in the Kwan house protecting me from understanding what exactly we were in the middle of. My hands were shaking when I set the letter down, and then I saw what was tucked behind it. A small slip of paper folded in half, separate from everything else, as though it had been placed there more recently. In her handwriting, 7 digits, a Seoul area code. No name, no explanation, just a number. I sat with it for a long time, then I got up off the floor, found a notebook, and I started writing down everything I remembered. The house, the layout, the names I had overheard, the boy on the stairs, the patterns that had seemed normal to a 9-year-old child, because a 9-year-old child had no reference point for what normal actually looked like. I wrote for 4 hours straight because I understood now, sitting on that floor at 3 a.m. with my mother's silenced life spread out in front of me, that what happened to her was not an accident of circumstance, it was a system, and systems, unlike individual cruelties, can be dismantled, but only if someone is willing to name every piece of them. I didn't leave my apartment for 3 days, not because I couldn't, because I needed to let something finish breaking before I started building again, and there is a difference between falling apart and falling through. And I had learned the hard way that if you try to hold yourself together before you're ready, what you end up with isn't strength, it's a performance of strength, and performances collapse at the worst possible moments. So I let it happen. Day 1, I grieved my mother the way I hadn't let myself grieve her at the funeral, fully, without managing it. I sat with the photograph and the letter, and I let myself be furious on her behalf, because she had never allowed herself to be furious on her own. She had swallowed it and kept moving and rebuilt her life and raised me with her bare hands, and the people who had threatened and silenced her had continued on without consequence for 20 years. That fury was clean, it was honest, and I needed it. Day 2, I got practical, and I organized everything from the box into a sequence, the photograph, the termination letter, the number on the slip of paper, and began building a timeline. I added my own memories beside my mother's documents, dates where I could estimate them, names where I had them, physical descriptions where I didn't, the layout of the house, the faces of the men who came and went through rooms we were not supposed to enter. I did not know yet what any of it would amount to. I just knew that a story only stays buried as long as no one decides to dig. Day 3, I almost convinced myself it was hopeless. That was the most dangerous day. Because the logical part of my mind, the part that had kept me alive and fed and employed through years of difficult circumstances, started making its case. What exactly did I think I was doing? I was a former waitress with a terminated contract, a landlord who wanted me out, a bank account draining towards zero, and a box of documents belonging to a dead woman. Against a family whose name made entire rooms rearrange themselves. Against a matriarch who had dismantled my professional life without breaking a sweat. I sat at my kitchen table and stared at the wall and thought very seriously about letting it go. And then I thought about my mother's face in that photograph. Not the expression, the posture, the way she was standing in front of that house like she was bracing for something. Like some part of her already knew what was coming and had decided to stand anyway. She had not raised me to let things go. She had raised me to wait for the right moment. And I picked up the slip of paper with the 7 digits, dialed. It rang 3 times, then a woman's voice, precise, unhurried, and unmistakably Korean accented. I was wondering when you would call. My grip tightened on the phone. You know who I am? I know who your mother was, she said. And I've been waiting 11 years for someone connected to that house to be both angry enough and ready enough to do something about it. When I finally stood my ground, they called me reckless. They said I didn't understand what I was dealing with, that I was too small, too alone, too late. But tell me, Tho, where were any of them when my mother was being threatened into silence in a foreign country with a child on her hip? Oh, where were they when I was wiping wine off a tablecloth while a room full of powerful people laughed under their breath? If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your dignity, and chosen dignity anyway, this channel is your space. Subscribe, not for me, for every quiet person who decided that being broken in the right places was the beginning, not the end. Her name was Dr. Xiaomire, and she already knew everything. Dr. Xiaomire did not waste words. She told me that later, that she had learned early in her career that every unnecessary word was a place for doubt to enter. So she spoke in facts, precise ones, and she expected the same from the people she chose to work with. She chose them carefully. We met in person 2 days after that phone call, a small, window-facing table at a coffee shop in a neighborhood neither of us lived in. She arrived before me, which I suspected was always true of her. A Korean-Nigerian woman in her mid-40s with the kind of stillness that reminded me immediately and uncomfortably of Jin-ho. Not cold, just controlled in the way that people are controlled when they have spent a very long time operating in environments that punish visible emotion. She slid a folder across the table before I had finished sitting down. 11 years, she said simply. That is how long I have been building this. I opened the folder. What was inside was dense. Financial records, corporate registrations, transaction histories that ran through more shell structures than I could follow, but the shape of it was clear even to me. The Kwan family network was not just a wealthy household, it was an operational system. Domestic staff brought into homes across 3 countries, used as unwitting participants in transactions that required human presence, signatures, witnessed exchanges, document handling, that could not be tied back to the family directly. They needed people who wouldn't ask questions, Dr. Seo said. People who were grateful for the employment. People who could be threatened into silence if they started to understand what they were a part of. My mother's face in that photograph settled into the back of my mind. How many? I asked. That we can document? 43 that we believe, significantly more. I closed the folder carefully. What do you need from me? A witness, she said. I have the financial architecture. When I have the paper trail, what I don't have is a living human being who is inside that house and can put a face and a voice to what the documents describe. Someone who experienced it, someone credible, composed, and willing to go on record. She looked at me directly. Your mother could not be that person. You can. The weight of that sentence sat between us for a moment. Then she added, Jinho has been in contact. I looked up. He told me to call you 2 years ago. A pause. I waited until you were ready. He's been involved in this for 2 years? Longer. She folded her hands on the table. Jinho was brought into the Kwan family's network as a young man. They positioned him as an asset, someone they could use to extend their reach into markets they couldn't access directly. What they didn't account for was that he was paying attention to everything they were building. She said it the way you'd describe a trap closing slowly. He spent the next decade building a separate empire using knowledge they gave him access to. Then he began buying out their alliances, quietly, systematically. The dinner you worked that night was one of their last significant partnership opportunities. A deal that would have stabilized everything they've been losing. I thought about the way the room had gone still when he said, we're done. He walked away from billions, I said. He walked away from the last piece of cover they had, she corrected. That's different. She stood, tucking the folder under her arm. I need your formal testimony within the week, written first, then recorded. Jinho will reach out, as when he does, don't send him away. She left 2 20s on the table for 2 coffees that had cost $11 combined and walked out without looking back. I sat there for a while. The plan had existed long before I dropped that wine glass. The alliances had been forming while I was surviving, one shift at a time. I had walked into the Aurelius Grand that night, thinking I was a waitress. I was, apparently, the last piece of something that had been waiting years to be completed. Dr. Seo gave me 3 days to rest. I used none of them. The morning after our meeting, I was at her office by 7, a deliberately unremarkable building in a deliberately unremarkable part of the city, the kind of place that makes you feel like nothing important could possibly happen there. That, I was learning, was exactly the point. She didn't look surprised to see me. We worked every day for 3 weeks straight. The formal testimony came first. Dr. Seo was methodical about it in a way that initially frustrated me. She didn't want the emotional version, not yet. She wanted the structural version first. Dates, locations, physical descriptions, sequences of events in the order they occurred rather than the order they hurt. She said that emotion was powerful, but that emotion without structure gave opposing attorneys something to dismantle. So I built it like a house. Foundation first. I described the Kwan estate room by room, so the layout, the staff routines, the areas we were permitted in, and the areas that were quietly, firmly off limits without anyone ever saying so directly. I described the men who came and went in the evenings, not through the main entrance, but through a side door near the kitchen that my mother and I passed every morning. I described the documents that changed hands in those rooms, the names I overheard, the one night I saw my mother standing very still outside a closed door listening, and the way she looked at me when she realized I had seen her. Not afraid exactly, aware. Dr. Seo recorded everything. And then she showed me what my memories meant inside her larger framework. And the picture that assembled itself was worse than I had imagined. The Kwan family had been running a quiet laundering operation through their domestic properties for decades. The staff, people like my mother, brought in through agencies with no local connections, no legal leverage, and enormous amounts to lose, had been used as human infrastructure. Their presence in those homes created a layer of plausible normalcy around transactions that would otherwise have been impossible to explain. My mother had not just been a housekeeper. She had, without ever being told, been a mechanism. I sat with that for a long time. Then I kept going. In the second week Jinho came, he arrived at Dr. Seo's office on a Tuesday morning without announcement, though I noticed Dr. Seo didn't look up from her work when he walked in, which told me his arrival was anything but unplanned. He sat across from me, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. Then, "I should have reached out sooner." "Yes," I said, "you should have." He accepted that without defense. Another thing I filed away about him, he filled in the pieces Dr. Seo had outlined. His years inside the Quan network, the specific access he had been given and what he had done with it. Not for them, but against them, slowly and patiently, the partnerships he had quietly bought out, the allies he had redirected, the financial corridors he had rerouted until the Quan family's operation was a house with no exits left. The dinner at Aurelius Grand had been their last viable door. When you said that word," he said quietly, "I knew who you were. I knew whose daughter you were, and I knew we were out of time." He looked at me steadily. "Your mother's letter is the piece that makes the human cost undeniable. Numbers can be argued, a threat written on household stationery, signed, stamped, dated, cannot." By week 3, we had everything, the documents, the testimony, the financial architecture. All we needed now was the right room. The Quan Foundation annual legacy gala was their coronation. That was the only word for it. Every year, the family gathered the most powerful people in their network under one roof, business figures, media representatives, political allies, and reminded all of them, through the careful choreography of the evening, exactly who sat at the center of things. It was a celebration dressed as philanthropy, control dressed as generosity. This year, it was being held at the Meridian Tower, 42nd floor, private ballroom, a guest list that people spent years trying to get onto. Jinho was already on it. You don't exclude the man who built the second largest private equity portfolio in the region without signaling to every other guest that something is wrong, so his invitation stood. And when he submitted a +1 3 days before the event, no name attached, which was within the rules of the invitation protocol, nobody questioned it. I wore my mother's only piece of good jewelry, a thin gold bracelet she had bought herself the year we finally left Seoul, the year she decided that the life behind us was finished and the one ahead deserved marking. She wore it on special occasions and ordinary Tuesdays with equal intention. It was the most deliberate thing I owned. I put it on and didn't look in the mirror again after that. We arrived together, yes, not dramatically, not announced. We simply walked in the way that people walk into rooms they have every right to be in, which is the most disarming entrance there is. No hesitation, no performance. Madame Yoon saw me within the first 4 minutes. I know because I was watching for it. Her composure held. Of course it did. She was a woman who had spent a lifetime mastering the precise art of not giving anything away in public. But there was a half second, a single small window between seeing my face and reassembling her expression, where something flickered behind her eyes, not fear, not yet, recognition, and the particular displeasure of someone who believed they had already handled something, confronted with evidence that it had not stayed handled. She turned to the man beside her and said something low and brief. He nodded and moved away from the group. I noted that too. The evening proceeded exactly as these evenings always proceeded. Cocktails, careful conversation, the performance of people who have known each other long enough to speak in a private language of implication and omission. Jinho moved through the room with the ease of someone who had attended 100 of these events and found all of them equally transparent. At 8:47, Dr. Seo's disclosures went live. 6 financial publications simultaneously, the documents, corporate registrations, transaction records, the paper architecture of 30 years of carefully hidden operation, released with full sourcing, full legal review, and the names of 43 former domestic workers attached as a formal witness record. My mother's name was first on that list. At 9:02, Jinho was invited to the podium to give what the program listed as brief remarks from a distinguished guest. He stood at the microphone for a moment without speaking. The room quieted in the way rooms quiet when they sense that something is about to shift. Then he spoke. Not with anger, not with theater, with the specific, unhurried calm of someone who's been waiting a very long time to say true things in a room full of people who have been protected from them. He named every practice, every mechanism, at every category of person who had been used and threatened and silenced to keep the operation running. He referenced the published disclosures by name. He listed the regulatory bodies that had already been formally notified. He did not look at Madame Yoon once. He didn't need to. When he finished and stepped back from the microphone, the room did not erupt. It did not applaud or gasp or any of the things rooms do in films at moments like this. It went quiet in a very specific way. The way rooms go quiet when everyone in them is recalculating privately and simultaneously, and no one wants to be the first to show their hand. Then he turned to me and nodded once, and I walked to the microphone. I did not give a speech. I unfolded a single document, my mother's termination letter from the Kwan estate in 1998, and I read it aloud, first in Korean, then in English, every word, including the last paragraph, including the threat. My voice did not shake. When I finished, I folded it again carefully, placed it back in my coat pocket, and stepped away. Madame Yoon stood up from her table. And that was when the doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Not dramatically, not with sirens or chaos or anything that would give the room permission to look away. Just 4 people in suits walking in with the quiet authority of individuals who had been expected. And Madame Yoon, for the first time in what I suspected was a very long time, had nowhere to go. The weeks that followed were quiet. That surprised people. They expected noise, arrests in the street, dramatic press conferences, chaos. But power doesn't always collapse the way it falls in films. Sometimes it just drains, slowly, methodically, until one morning you look at what's left and realize the structure is already gone. Regulatory investigations were formally opened within 10 days. 3 Kwan board members resigned before the end of the month. Aurelius Grand lost its operating license. Turns out a restaurant built on Kwan investment money becomes a liability when that money is under formal review. The agency that had placed my mother and dozens like her in households across 3 countries was dissolved pending investigation. My mother's name entered the official record, a protected whistleblower, posthumously, but officially, permanently. 11 other former domestic workers came forward in the month after the gala, then 19 more. I didn't become wealthy from any of it. I didn't become powerful in the conventional sense. But I became something that had been taken from my mother and from me for a very long time. Undeniable. Jin Ho and I sat across from each other in a small restaurant 3 weeks after the gala. Not the kind with chandeliers and white tablecloths, just a place with good food and no performance required. He told me that the first time he heard me say Gwenkanayo, he recognized the specific way people say it's okay when they've spent years learning to say it in houses that were never theirs. He had said it himself once. I understood. My mother taught me that silence is not the same as surrender. She was right. She was always right. I was just the one who finally got to prove it. She never got to see it. That's the part that stays with me. My mother carried that letter for 20 years and never saw the day it mattered. She rebuilt her life from scratch in a foreign country with a child and no safety net and not one word of complaint, and she didn't live long enough to watch everything she endured be dragged into the light. So, I want to ask you something, and I need you to sit with it honestly. Is there someone in your life, a mother, or a grandmother, a woman who built everything quietly and got nothing publicly, and whose story deserves to be told, whose silence was never chosen, just required? Because those stories don't disappear when the people who live them do. They wait. They wait for someone angry enough, ready enough, and brave enough to pick up the box. If this story moved you, if any part of it felt like something you've carried, leave a comment below. Tell me whose story you're thinking of right now. I read every single one. Like this video, if you believe that quiet strength is still strength, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that surviving was never the ceiling. It was just the beginning. And subscribe to Afro-Noir Chronicles because we have more stories like this one. Stories about women who were counted out and came back with receipts. Stories that will make you feel seen, make you feel furious, and remind you every single time that the people who get underestimated have always been the most dangerous ones in the room. We'll see you in the next one, and to my mother, wherever you are, this one was always yours.